Hello everyone, today we talk about Flemish and Lorenese knights and Ministeriales during the 10th and 11th century. So we have introduced in the medieval knighthood series this, investigation, let's say, on the figure of the Milites, that is the knights essentially, and the Ministeriales in their phase of development. Actually, you know what we're talking about. I mean, we made several videos about it, medieval knighthood developing with very deep roots back in history, but definitely defining itself, especially during the 10th century. 10th century is a crucial moment in which, of course, the most, let's say, stereotypical knight is yet to be formed in its political, juridical, and military dimension that would fundamentally consolidate during the 12th century. But the 10th century, as the moment of highest political fragmentation during post-Carolingian times, made originate this new class of military professionals that at the same time were essentially the political leaders of medieval Europe, that started feeling kind of a common consciousness, an awareness of their social prestige and status and military power, and sharing certain characters that, although already existed before in the European military culture, definitely now were taking especially an increasingly aristocratic character. And this went in parallel with a political and social segmentation, stratification, that entailed the presence not just of the ultra elite of the top, but in an intermediate phase of other figures, among which we include the Ministeriales, right? Now we will explain who they were. And that, however, through the evolution of what would become the feudalism, here we are still largely now kind of a vassalic beneficiary dimension. Then feudalism develops, consolidates like really a political and social system as we know it later on in the 12th century, especially, as we've seen, and that would eventually fit into very important levels of society, and that, however, had originated essentially as non-freemen. This could be either half-free men or serfs, like so this servile, semi-servile condition that was recognized at one point juridically in feudal law, in the sense that these relations began to emerge in quite spontaneously, and eventually were just sanctioned by common law, by the fact that these were relations that had established themselves in fact during the 10th century, that, as you know, was a very important century, but also pretty tumultuous one, let's say, because of the second invasions, because of this militarization of society. We can't call it in that way, which of course is debatable, because it depends here what we mean by militarily. But when we talk about milites, in fact, and the milis singular is exactly what we want to define, the knighthood, right? And these other individuals that were fighters themselves, and they were professionals of war, but by certain standards, definitely, came to acquire, especially in certain regions of Europe, in Central Europe especially, a very important role, right? The figure of the Ministeriales is typical, essentially, of the Eastern Frankish and eventually German kingdom, right? And that's why we made videos about this, that I can give you some titles of. First of all, we made actually only one video about this, specifically speaking, that is Ottonian knighthood at the origins of the German Ministeriales, so starting here in the 10th century and connected to the structuration of the political and military force of the Ottonian dynasty as kings of Germany and Roman emperors. And then I also made a video about the Flemish army's organization between the 11th and 13th century, which partly fits there more specifically with this geographical area that we will talk about today. Together, essentially, it's Flanders and Lorraine, as you see here, we've said. Then there is something perhaps in this other videos early nice development of the feudal military class in the 11th century actually, post-Hohenstaufen Germany, and first steps of Frederick I Barbarossa as king of Germany, which is important because objectively Frederick I of Hohenstaufen, boosted, let's say, the development of the Ministeriales as such that had already been quite a thing since Salian times, but in fact had originated before in the century before. So the Ministeriales here, like, it's obvious that there are many differentiations that actually today we will in part see in this narrower time and space compared to, I don't know, the whole medieval Germany, right? Medieval, here it's not even properly Germany as such, but this area between the Western and the Eastern Frankish kingdoms that between Romans and Germanic worlds, and that takes a bit of a particular shape on its own and essentially towards a decentralized direction. And that's why it's very fascinating to look at it, because it has characteristics that differ, but you will see even at a local level that there were different types of relations between the Milites, the Ministeriales, or other names that these guys were called, all in a kind of a let's say, sclerotized way, like this thing was forming exactly at this point, or at least had been forming since quite maybe late Carolingian times, and however it goes all in parallel with the development of knighthood proper. And the term ministerialis in Latin actually means, an administrator. Like, that was usually associated with a person of lesser rank, which didn't mean that this person wasn't rich or powerful, whatever, but simply, that's the same etymology of the Latin name that gives you administrator comes from adminus, that is means to the lesser, a person deputed to the lesser things, right? And the term ministerialis, there are certain words that come straight like from ancient times to medieval times without no solution of discontinuity, let's say, that however take certain characters, acquire certain meanings, let's say, over time, depending on the society they're applicated in. And in this post-Carolingian context, the ministerialis is essentially, in fact, an administrator associated normally to lordly rule of some sort, right? After Carolingian Empire collapsed, basically public authority was at its weakest, right? In Carolingian times, telling the truth, public authority was very low in general, and we've been talking about this actually for a long time. We've made many videos. If you go into the playlist Carolingian Europe, you will understand that. But it's obvious that after the collapse of this more or less efficient system, everything was deputed to the local lords, and that took matters in their own hands. Also because they were kind of obliged by the situation. This was a very important moment in European history that is dramatically overlooked in general, because it's the one that effectively made the Middle Ages as we think it, stereotypically, like the Ancien Régime broadly meant started, and it was a moment in which a great part even of juridical traditions and of, in fact, political military culture in Europe started proper. And ministerialis began essentially as a generic term, like a generic administrator, like it didn't have essentially a military character. But it's obvious that as much as lordships developed, the necessity of entrusting the control of certain lands, even at some kind of a large distance, as these lordly assets were growing large, also geographically speaking, was increasing, which means that the ministerialis started acquiring a kind of a higher status over time, which depends, because at the same time the ministerialis could be really At this time, it wasn't like how it would develop in low medieval times, especially in the Kingdom of Germany, where they would become essentially knights like all the others. Like in southern Germany during the 13th century, basically 90% of the knights were ministeriales. And they were technically serfs, but in practice they were freemen, like in the sense that they were as powerful as the other knights, and the nobility had to, to deal with them if they wanted to do anything at a local level, politically speaking. And eventually, in fact, in the 14th century, this term ceases to exist because it didn't even make sense anymore to consider these guys as non-freemen, right? But the responsibility entrusted to these individuals sometimes was very high, and it could have also a military-oriented character, right? Not always, but it came to define it, especially in Central Europe, right? And in these lands were that, in part, debatably, were more militarized than the others. Like especially in Central Europe, there was a very slow evolution of, let's say, the construction of public authority. By certain standards, it kind of failed over time, even during the Middle Ages, to establish itself. Germany, this broader Central European area, was not even, it didn't even have a firm border. Like at this time in the 10th century was ravaged by the Hungars that of course arrived up to Spain, up to southern Italy, up to the Channel, and in fact investing in these territories of Flanders and Lorraine. And then we will see how the Ministeriales at that point took a military role even for defending the local lords on which they depended by these incursions. But in the east, even with the formation of certain kingdoms like, I don't know, the Polish, the Bohemian, the Hungarian one, this broader area was somewhat very, we can say unstable, necessarily speaking, but it didn't quite have a firm center, especially in Germany proper, telling the truth, because actually Slavic kingdoms were kind of more, at least if you take Bohemia compared to Germany at one point, it was kind of more centralized in nature, even Hungary. And the concept here is, though, that in this broader privatization of power, the same Ministeriales rises to a status that was actually impressive, right? And we can see this, interestingly, in certain peculiar forms in this area of Central Europe that would be Lorraine. Like it eventually split up into parts like Lower Lorraine that basically vanished like a district, and it's mostly the county of Flanders that evolved, that came to be an important feudal district, and the Duchy of Lorraine in the south, right? And these areas, as you know, were technically like part of, they came to fall, certain parts of them, especially Flanders, came to fall in part in the Western Frankish kingdom, but this broader area would be part mostly of the, was under control, let's say, preferably of the Eastern Frankish king, let's say, as emperor, telling the truth. And in fact, most of these territories were part of what we call like the Holy Roman Empire, that in theory had to encompass the whole Western Europe, at least, but in practice was effectively limited by other powers around. But this era of the Northwestern Holy Roman Empire was essentially largely autonomous. It was a character that these lands had acquired since post-Carolingian times. That there had the attempts to make of this area a kind of a unitary one with a compact. Like it didn't even happen. Like there were, for example, a part attached to it was the kingdom of Arles in the south that theoretically was part of. It wasn't even part of. It was part of the territories that were given to the Lotharingia proper, but eventually also detached itself, and at least a point it had a kind of a unity. Like in this area instead of Lorraine, there was nothing. Like there was not a continuity of that kind. There were communities and different environments that couldn't really be kept together. As a consequence, the privatization of local power increased compared to other areas, right? And especially here, as we will see, the ecclesiastical lords had a great impact, right? And it's very interesting to study at this point, to observe how the Milites and the Ministeriales were defined at this level, and which social recognition and military function was entrusted to them fundamentally. And we could make, today we will talk chiefly about these areas, but we could extend this comparisons, so we will keep making videos about these various areas of Europe and how they evolved differently. For example, Flanders and Lorraine were quite similar to Burgundy in part. Also there are interesting differences with Normandy, also were fairly close. The same Germany. Actually, these areas were a bit of middle ground, right, between the development of very great dynasties, but also the and let's say vassalic lineages, but at the same time also the permanence of certain communal militias, we can say, as of freemen, right, that would become increasingly famous in later times, and in fact that is mostly what we discuss in the video on the medieval Flemish armies organization during the 11th and the 13th century. So what is interesting, I would say, to start off, in fact, is this similarity with Burgundy, right? As if Burgundy was very wealthy and kind of and developed powerful vassalic beneficiary lineages, and therefore lands that were also in contact with the same Lorraine and Flanders, as we know. And in these areas you could find kind of a precocious development of the so-called Milites castri, right, which means actually the knights of the castle, meant as these warriors, these fighters that were entrusted the control of a fortification. Like, this was a garrison of knights, literally. In fact, the Milites castri or castrenses, the difference simply being castri meaning of the castle, and castrenses meaning like chatelains, by themselves, the adjective. And these were in fact bands of warriors drawn from the local inhabitants that in turn were called to defend this fortification. Was under the control of a castellanus, that is a chatelain, that in fact commanded them according to the situation. And I think especially in this area of Europe there was a precocious autonomy in the military organization that in fact entailed the same, the castellans would be the normal let's say agent of control, the major feudatories on the territory that also remained long in time at the head of the same cities of Flanders, for example, that, as you know, were pretty large urban settlements, also with their own urban militias, etc. So really framing the military organization of communities that, however, were already used to be very autonomous over time. The same county of Flanders had been born because of these defensive needs, because of Viking incursions, and the fact that these lands were normally too far from the Frankish heartland to receive assistance, or at least they were left behind compared to other areas, and they were given in fact this kind of autonomies that would become kind of in fact characteristic of this area, politically speaking, that was always very kind of jealous of its own freedom and political liberties, right? So as we have seen here, the presence of the Milites castri is actually the indicator of something more than just local militias, but in fact of milites, that is, of knights, right? So a form of military organization that in regions like Flanders and Burgundy reflect a solidly vassalic clientele developing and managing of putting together this knights and equipping them and fitting them and using them for the control of the territory, right? And the same was in Lorraine. And in there, in fact, like in general within the territories of the empire, is more impressive the presence of those who in fact rendered this military service on horseback, known as Ministeriales, that is, functionaries whose personal juridical condition was often the one of half freemen, of non-freemen, right? Or that is, of serfs, non-serfs, etc., and depended on a lord. I'm talking, by the way, about territories of the empire, because you know that the Flanders technically were in part French and part kind of imperial, and the Counts of Flanders were one of the peers of France from an early time. It were this also imperial lands, and Lorraine was instead framed within the empire, you know, with the approximations that we have given before. And in Lorraine, in fact, would develop between the 10th and the 11th century a strong ministeriality, right? To whom were entrusted functions of domestic dominion, let's say, and military character, right? So this reveals naturally a strong organization of the local vassalic clienteles, the extension even of the lordly territories, and the need of developing a class that could keep things together, like being equipped at in a comparable way to the same milites, right? But albeit depending juridically on the lord as non-freemen. And these all of this had to bring, of course, such group to a social prestige and to a economical civil condition, that is, in other words, a lifestyle that were much superior to the one of certain freemen themselves, which is paradoxical, but this happened all the time, right? In post-Carolingian Europe, like the fact that you were not free, juridically speaking, didn't mean actually that you were poorer than freemen, right? It could happen the other way around, because now these men were essentially making a career as serfs under lordly rule, which other freemen normally didn't, right? So there are certain situations in which freemen would be also willing to lose their freedom in order to enter to be part of the seigneurial clientele, which was a big deal, right, and a great investment for the future. And regarding the use of the ministeriales to military ends, well, it seems that it was largely the ecclesiastical lords to predilect the ministeriales rather than the laymen, right? And this is important because the serfs now were fighting on horseback, like with the other knights, and this was a very convenient choice because they costed less, for example, and they, at least originally, and this is important to bear in mind, they didn't have the need of honores, right? And since they were juridically depending as a personal condition, you could make them do way more than that was asked. That you could ask essentially to the vassals of free condition. So rather than seeing this as like just as a as an option, you have to realize what this meant politically and socially, because these were people drawn literally from some of the most humble strata of the population, and they were chosen naturally in part as fighters, and that were given an opportunity now to kind of redeem themselves socially by being actually paid at the end of the day, because that's also the point, as we will see, by the Lord, right? And obviously in exchange of a service. So this was the, in a way, the attempt to let's say, to create a new wave of vassals, however, that could be more faithful to the local lords, to use as a power against those vassals that had become too rich and too powerful. And that's exactly why also the ecclesiastic lords that were so powerful were could afford these troops, because the vassals technically were, the lay vassals were now too powerful to be imposed a service, right? Vassals were trying to were largely autonomous on their own, and which authority, especially in this such a decentralized area, geographically speaking, could impose it to them, right? So even the ecclesiastical lords had to take matters in their own hands to defend their own assets, and since they were not excluded from the vassalic system, but essentially in their lands, they could also do whatever the hell they liked, because they were still entrusted by the king or the emperor certain lands, and therefore they had even to provide their own military clientele. However, they could organize them on their own. And the Ministeriales in this condition were essentially equal as knights, albeit they began kind of like a lower unit in some form. Like we can't think that originally they were not so affluent like the other knights, because they had still to be created as such. So you can see at this point that besides the knights, there would always be some sort of lighter horsemen that were either squires or other, in fact, retinues that necessarily had to support to carry out the most, actually sometimes even the most dangerous tasks, like scouting, skirmishing, raiding, and all this stuff. That the Milites here were starting to become something much heavier, kind of, in fact, more expensive, that also couldn't, tactically speaking, cover all the roles, even if at this point knighthood was still extremely flexible in the sense it actually they will always remain like that, but compared to the knights of the lower Middle Ages, it would become increasingly heavier and costly. You know, these troops were still very, very let's say they were always multitask, and they would remain always multitask, because knights have always fought literally in every single possible way in all single times in history. But tendentially, the more feudalism developed, and the more the knight was essentially a heavy cavalryman fighting and specializing increasingly in a collective training, especially for performing that specific tactical role, right? And what is interesting is that actually through the sources we don't really understand clearly how the Ministeriales, or these other, wherever they were called, by the way, because there were many names too, actually originated. Sometimes we find them when they were already created in the documents, in the sources, right? And for example, in 954 we know that there were probably at least warriors on horseback of non-frequent personal condition forming the ecclesia militia of the monastery of Lobs in today's Hainaut in Belgium. And this is how far, in fact, the Hungars came to raid. And this monastery had its own militia, right? And this was perfectly normal, right? This happened, like, this of course would evolve sometimes in certain ecclesiastical principalities that had enormous power. In lower, a few centuries later, the abbey of Fulda in Germany would have allegedly something like 20,000 men in service. These things were beginning even as bands of contractors sometimes, but also of local troops that were drawn from the land that the same monasteries owned. And as you know, in the empire, the ecclesiastical lords had quite of a power, had been instrumental, in fact, especially also to support the crown, generally against the privatistic push of the lay nobility. There is also another very interesting case in the Anselmi Gesta episcoporum Leodiensium, so the deeds of the bishops of Liège, in which it's written that the famous bishop of Liège, Notger, at the end of the 10th century, distributed 1/3 of the domains of the principality to his qui militiam exercerent. Right? So here, literally quoting, idem prudente concilio predia ecclesia in tres equas portiones divisit, quarum unam suis et successorum usibus alteram servientibus per ecclesias et per monasteria, tertiam is qui militiam exercerent concessit. Right, so here basically the bishop subdivides the territorial principality to this use. Right, always bear in mind that ecclesiastical land didn't go like fractioned, dynastically speaking. It remained all one, but yet within the same property, certain areas were naturally deputed to certain functions. And of course this happened because of, depending on, the character of the land, of the communities that inhabited them. And here, I don't think we have further details, historically speaking, but here it's fractioned in 3/3. The first one, it's essentially a kind of a private possession for the bishop and his successors. The other is actually for the divine office, for the churches and the monasteries, so that had to be maintained in some way. The third one is dedicated to his qui militiam exercerent. That is, those who exercise the militia, as we have defined it. So here we immediately get that a certain amount of the episcopal assets were destined to people that are meant at exercising properly this craft, we can say, right? Because it was really a craft, the one of arms. And we are almost completely sure that this comprehended, as we will see later in other examples, freemen and non-freemen. Right, that is, and of course, what was the difference? Like, of course, there were pre-existing, here we are at the end of the 10th century, so of course the kind of society would progressively head towards increasing stratification, but there were still those certain differences, like being free or non-free, that at one point wouldn't make a difference, as we've seen before, in the moment you had to exercise this function, right? So you were given some land, even if you were not a freeman, but because this land didn't belong to you, it belonged to the Bishop of Liège. So you could, the bishop didn't care if you were a freeman or not, as long as you did your job, right? So these were essentially like vassals, because they received land in exchange for military service. And the link between the military performance of the militia and the fact that these guys, in part at least, were non-freemen, is the fact that the first is used as the very same terminology for those satellites or gregarii milites that in 1047 constituted the army of the Bishop Wazzo of Liège. So satellites meaning literally satellites, so these guys that gravitated around the bishopric here, or gregarii milites, that it means in this sense knights that kind of aggregated around, so it's the same concept. I mean, the idea that there is a core of knights that are probably freemen, or that are, however, part of the usual vassalatic clienteles, to which are added these other people that eventually enjoy maybe a different status, right? That these documents feel the need to distinguish as such, right? But that in the political, military, and social practice are becoming fundamentally the same, because they're, in the case here, they're called Milites themselves. So here we are still in the bishopric of Liège. And there is by the way, if you want to study this thing, there is a beautiful work that is in French. I don't know what it's translated. It's Étude sur les Ministériales by Ganshof. It was a prominent Belgian historian who wrote about these topics. So I even put a photo of him in here, just to thank him for the work he's done. And that shows us, for example, that in Lorraine we often meet the case of serfs to whom is entrusted a land, of which it will pay the census only, quote, si more militis noluerit de servire, si vero voluerit nihil solvat, which literally means, that you will have, that this guy will obtain the land and will pay the census only he will not want to serve militarily, and that instead will not have to pay in total, like nihil solvat. So he will not have to pay anything if instead he will perform this military service. And this is beautiful because it gives you also the flexibility of this system. Like here we're not talking about very, there weren't quite central structures. These lands were controlled in a decentralized fashion, etc. So the concept is that there was even a heterogeneity in the way they were administered. So here it's being left to these people, that are serfs, by the way. They're not freemen, they're serfs, so technically they're dependent on the lord, but they can freely choose whether to serve or not, right? And at that point there is a difference, of course, because if they will serve, they will not have to pay anything for their land. If they will not want to serve, they will have to pay for it. So this speaks, if anything, for the comparable status, essentially, of these military serfs, these fighters that could essentially decide freely whether to serve or not, and with consequences that were regulated by the seigneurial administration eventually. So this was essentially a behavior more militis, right? So in the fashion of knights, that of course ended up into a social promotion of these serfs. After all, they effectively performed their military service, so they were in the material condition of affording, if anything, their military equipment. Hence, by themselves, they had their own political and military power, even if they weren't juridically free, right? And this is really the key of understanding of those times and places, because this makes you understand how variegated and fluid and still evolving the post-Carolingian world was in here. Here, the juridical discriminant is not important much in the measure of, which rights you have, which you don't, but really under which clientele you're framed, and what you can do about it, and how you still correspond. Like this is really a kind of a social contract after all, right? And not everywhere it was like this. In fact, in Germany, you could literally be sold as a ministerialis. You could be this place. In other places, we know families of ministerialis that had been living for centuries in a land. One day, because of dynastic changes of the local land, etc., they could be brought from the other side of Germany. And these were dramatic events, together with all their families, etc. I mean, what I would like to make you understanding here is that these were real communities that also shared, by the way, not differently, I think, from knights, this common craft. I mean, this sense of belonging, for example, to a military community. These ministeriales surely felt like they were accommodated by a common lifestyle, that it wasn't that different from the one of the Milites. And think about how unruly and troubled and kind of violent also these environments were, and what this practically meant. It practically meant that these guys were a firm military presence locally. So that the local lord could count on these individuals as well, but also had to care about them, in the sense that he had to watch them, because they had effectively a power that were usually not to abuse of towards their patron, let's say, but that also could be, say, diverted in certain conditions. And for example, we have also certain fiscal documents from Beaulieu in France that actually are comparable, because in this case these documents prove that it was very different, but very different, to distinguish between a knight that is a miles, a freeman, and who, albeit actually carrying out the same identical function, actually was not. Right here, it starts being also a matter of, knighthood starts being defined also in a certain sense of political prestige. It's not just about the function of the warrior. These ministeriales instead are factually more like they're at least characterized chiefly by the fact that they are warriors, as much as knights, but with still a different social status that precludes them certain ways, right? But that at a local level and on the battlefield means substantially the same by certain standards, and this is very interesting. So these means, among the other things, that the militia was and would remain, at least up to part of the 12th century, an open class. Still very fluid and undistinguished from a juridical point of view, even though there was a tendency to stereotype it on a social, moral, and behavioral level, which naturally was real, right? These ministeriales quite likely actually were considered something different, socially speaking. Morally and behaviorally, they were surely something different from the others. They were fundamentally fighters. They made their living as fighters. They were called like to arms. They would have to defend the Lord, and this entailed a lot of things, as you imagine, from a human point of view, from a political, from a social one, that really count, that really have an impact eventually in that same world. And in certain areas, among those that would concur to form modern Belgium, appeared certain particular types of tenanciers that were defined as Cavallarii or Cavallarii, and were distinguished from the Milites. For example, there is this document from Folcwini Gesta abbatum Sancti Bertini that tells also in here that there was some land that the abbey of in fact of Saint-Bertin, that is in today's Saint-Omer in France, that were distributed some land, and these were called, in fact, let's say, servizio bidevare provedire. Okay, let's read it here. Abbas igitur ad alardus villas ad fratrum usus pertinentes vel quicquid ex inde sub qualicunque servitio videbatur provenire, absque isque in alis ministeriis erant distribute, vel que militibus et cavallaris erant beneficiate. Tali iusit brevitate describere, etc. And so this means here that there was some land that was entrusted to certain ministeria. Here, the ministeria are these functions, these roles, whatever, they're lesser ones, but that included, compared to the abbey as the core, as the landed seigneury, so the central direction, that included land. In fact, it was distributed to the militibus et cavallaris, and this is very interesting because here you have a distinction between the milites and the cavallarii that are substantially, milites we have defined it, cavallarii are literally the horsemen, right? Those who go on horseback. And we can think, of course, that was a difference from a typical point of view, as maybe the militaries were effectively kind of heavier cavalry with better equipment, better armor and weapons, right? Weaponry. Maybe the cavallarii were objectively just lighter horsemen with lighter armor, whatever. So it's possibly corresponding to a tactical segmentation as well, but we're not sure. Actually, it's more likely that this was fluid as well, that this differentiation stood mostly in certain social and juridical differences rather than actual tactical ones, because we don't know, in fact, how these troops were militarily organized. These chronicles are essentially talking about how the land that was owned by the abbey, in this case, was used, right? So it was put to use. So this is really a matter really of defining these people who received land. Then we don't know how they were brought on the battlefield, like whether they pertain to mixed units, that there were something distinct. We don't know, but they still coexist, and the important thing is that they're named together. That this distinction was important enough to call these guys in two different ways for some reason, but it also was kind of a practical use to conceive them together in terms of land distribution as a beneficium, right? So this is powerful, and this is very important in my opinion. And of course we can naturally observe from other terminology which roles these lesser knights could have. Some of them could be used as runners, for example, as messengers, or as escorts, for example. And for these specific functions, they were granted some tenures to at title of beneficium proper. So there were even lands that were given exactly for these types of services, right? For example, it was typical in the Carolingians, or to talk about the so-called cavallicatio, that in many areas of Europe was literally the equivalence of the chevauchee, talking about, but in a sort of more like the chevauchee is mostly a strategical thing, especially if we contextualize it in the most famous 100 Years' War time, where we mostly talk about it. But the cavallicatio was mostly like a police service that was performed, at least originally, because this is also a problem that terminologically speaking we have, on horseback, which means that there were certain services that were required that had historically a particular name, such as the cavallicatio, that was carried out probably on horseback, but that maybe not necessarily was really like that. And maybe the cavallicatio in itself had been transmuted into a census, so that this didn't even correspond to a service anymore in certain specific contexts, not necessarily this one, but was essentially a sum of money or of natural goods that were paid by people who owned a certain land, where maybe, you know, the former inhabitants had, the former communities had owed that service to the Lord, but now the guys who had settled there that they didn't want, or they didn't care, that they maybe it was even advantageous for the Lord to transform them into something different, but the tradition was that they owed that service, so they owed it in a way or in another. So maybe these guys now, instead of actually carrying that out, they paid money, and this money was used by the Lord to hire other troops. There maybe were other Ministeriales that received in turn other land. So it's very like, it's that messed up, if you were, but it's actually very logical from a functional point of view. And really, post-Carolingian Europe was all about this, right? And as we've seen, the Gesta abbatum Sancti Bertini, by citing the albeit distinguishing them, the Milites and the Cavallarii, demonstrate that there was a certain affinity between these two categories. And Ganshof, for example, believed that from these Cavallarii, specifically, might have been recruited later on the Ministeriales, right, of later times. They were up to this kind of more military life, right, because they were used to go on horseback and to handle weapons, right, and that, however, could at this point, I mean, it means some kind of different people, like not maybe these runners or escorts, etc., but actually the true mounted bodyguard of the lords. So, of course, over time, all these functions evolved. They didn't remain the way they were at the beginning, and there is, generally speaking, the improvement, like a bit in all the feudal system, of the social status of those who began in these early times as certain classes, and, you know, eventually kind of rose, you know, of throughout the ranks over time and becoming kind of something tougher. So maybe these guys had begun as runners, just as light cavalry to, you know, support other knights, and you know, throughout the generations, because usually these services were owed also in connection with the land, with the fact that, you know, your sons, for example, had to, by owning the same land, by certain conventions, they had to carry out the certain tasks of their fathers, etc. So maybe in 2 or 3 generations, that from simply light horsemen had become the very cream of the military class. So this is very, very meaningful. For example, in a description of the domains of the Abbey of Prüm, that is now that was in Lorraine, it's in today's Germany, in the diocese of Trier, right? They, in 893, appear other troops that are called Scararii, that have been interpreted seemingly as the evolution of the Carolingian Cavallarii, or at least this is how Ganshof has interpreted them. Scararii means literally the members of the Skara, that is the, like in German is the Schar, the rank, this military unit, right? That were usually actually picked troops in certain contexts. I mean, they had this also mounted character, right? So the I don't know now whether Ganshof studies have been you know, improved, enhanced, and kind of corrected regarding to this hypothesis, but I mean, the important datum here, and we don't have much evidence, because out of documentary sources, actually, we don't have much else, and by this age, like, it's so archaic and old that we have just basically the same knowledge. But the important is the continuity in the existence of a military function on horseback, in these regions after the collapse of the Carolingian world, which happens literally in every single post-Carolingian world, and these relations actually existed even beyond the Carolingian world. Like, you think among the Anglo-Saxons, the Slavs, even among the Muslims, I mean, there were all kind of similar things, and actually there is a tendency of all over Europe and the Mediterranean to have this kind of military services and this stratification of society, right, with development of heavier cavalry, etc. And the interesting thing, though, is that in this area of Lorraine, the Scararii continue to exist as a social class and a military class up to the 12th, 13th century, with the name of Scararii, Scaramanni, or Ministeriales, as a matter of fact. Right, which is very, very meaningful, because here you find even a terminological mix. Scararius stands for, like, as we've seen, just a guy who pertains to that unit. Scaramanni, the mannus is literally, you know, the man as freeman, right? In at least originally, of course, these words could mean everything in terms of juridical conditions, but they still have this kind of slight semantic differences in, and as ministeriales as well. And this speaks, however, for, you know, kind of a, especially the term Scara, it corresponds to a strictly military unit, like to a picked body of troops, and in this case are quite likely, as ministeriales as well, non-freemen. So, and I think, yeah, I think we can stop here for today. But as you understand, getting acquainted with these transformations is really understanding the whole political and social process that brought to the development of medieval knighthood, but also of the construction of feudal Europe after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, this 10th century, where so much had happened. As we have seen, the same Flanders, the same Lorraine were formed feudally in this moment, like, and this all required, in terms of territorial domination, the definition of certain military functions that had to be performed, as we have seen before with the monasteries that get aggressed by the Hungers, right? These guys needed troops to defend themselves, and not only, right, because these guys were fighting against each other pretty much constantly, right, and they were always involved in some form of military activity. This is not cultural. It's really about the fact that that world needed it. That it was not an option to use the military instrument at that point. It was worldwide the same thing for that kind of civilization development and political levels of centralization or better decentralization, and these guys needed constantly to ensure the continuity of their territorial dominations, to make use of these units that they had to train, they had to feed, and you know that at this point that the military equipment starts increasing. Like in the 10th century, there is especially not much of an evolution, a technical evolution, but progressively these guys become wealthier. There's a social certification. That is what really made the difference. Knights didn't improve their equipment over the centuries because of technical inventions that magically popped out from somewhere to make them fight that way. It's all political and social. It's people that had more land in their own hands, therefore they could practice more. And practicing on horseback costs an astonishing amount of energy that you need to have, like tens and tens of peasants breaking their backs on the land for providing you. These are enormous expenses. Having a coat of mail was like having a Ferrari, right? It was really an enormous deal, and naturally these conditions of juridical dependencies dependency were important assets themselves. It was not the evil lord now owning serfs. What an evil guy. No, these serfs actually were pretty lucky people. Like, being a ministerialis in this context meant you had made it successfully in life, right? Because actually the upper step was just the ultra elite that surely didn't represent the majority of the population. So actually being part it sometimes was better to be a serf and part of the military clientele of the lord, and than being just a free peasant, and maybe, however, didn't have much aside from a couple of maybe of land that was not even his own after all. And therefore, what was the difference at that point, factually speaking, aside from the juridical one, was just a namely one, right? And so it all depends, and this is a moment in which a lot of people, like, if you have really nothing to lose, these areas weren't, enormously developed yet. Maybe Flanders was starting something, but if you really have nothing to lose, why not trying that, that way, right? It's a risky business. You become a professional fighter. Life was short anyway, so maybe it was better to at least. And the important thing about this, though, is I also didn't stress, is that the Lord provided for your own equipment. Now, that was the single most important thing in the whole story, right? Historically speaking, all these major military changes in history, after all, were about who paid for the equipment, because this stuff was enormously expensive. So you, by becoming a protégé and a serf to someone, you, however, were given the means, the material means to carry out a certain type of life. So these ministeriales surely got some land, and they got the weaponry, and they were distributed to them by the Lord. Or maybe they also, of course, built their own in part. They purchased it somewhere, but they had their own autonomy in this sense, that they also used eventually in the lower Middle Ages, in a few centuries from then, telling the truth, 3 or 4 maximum. They would start to to become free, to be essentially free, de facto free, and actually having sometimes more power than, say, local vassals. We know of certain ministeriales in high medieval Germany that were actually, they had their own military retinues, they had their own, like, 70 castles, something like that, or maybe 50, I don't remember. And therefore they were sometimes more powerful even than, the royal vassals. So do you understand what it means? Of course, here in the 10th century, in the 11th, it wasn't like that. This is really the beginning of these functions. But just for saying how the thing progressed and kind of evolved, and by how the premise is that this thing was actually advantageous up to a certain point. And it's also very interesting to find, of course, this military units in service of chiefly ecclesiastical lords. This is also constant, and especially in this context where there isn't much of central authority. So also the ecclesiastical lords have to take matters in their own hands. They have to have military retinues just like all the others, and to behave like territorial lords like all the others, of course. Alright, so I think that for today it's everything. On another occasion we will talk about the other regions. So we will compare it. Normandy is very interesting, certain other areas of Burgundy. We will see at one point. Just know that this is just the beginning. I have theoretically infinite stuff we can talk about. So this was just about the ministeriales in 10th, 11th century Flanders and Lorraine. And for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.